Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us, the Zionist Federation of the UK and Ireland, and the WZO, the World Zionist Organization delegation here in the UK. Many of you might be returning to us, having joined us before for our series of webinars. But for all of those who perhaps haven't joined us before, I just want to quickly go through some house rules whilst we are still having people join. First of all, you know, as many of you have already got your videos on, please feel free to leave them on. But what we would ask is that you please make sure that your microphones are turned to mute so that we don't have any distracting background noises when our speaker is doing his presentation this evening. So if you can just bear that in mind and keep your microphones on mute, that will be much appreciated. As I say, welcome back. Welcome to anyone who's not joined us before for our webinar this evening. And we are very privileged, very lucky to have a young man who is an Anglo-Israeli. He made Aliyah some years ago. His name is Benjamin Lee. And Benjamin studied languages, French and Spanish, I think, at Leeds University. He subsequently made Aliyah in 2018 and started in the IDF as a lone soldier. So kol hakavod to Benjamin for such a brave and principled move and decision. Benjamin subsequently served in the international social media team of the IDF Spokesperson's unit, and he served there for 2 years before being released at the end of 2020. So that's you know, just 10 months ago. Earlier this year, he was called up again to return as a reservist soldier during May's conflict between Israel and Gaza, in what was named the Operation Guardian of the Walls. And he was, as I say, he was called up as a reservist to once again provide his services to the IDF Spokesperson unit. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Benjamin, who will talk through all of his fascinating experiences. So without further ado, Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you again, Steve, for your introduction. And thank you so much to you and your team at the ZF for hosting me for this event. The work you do here in the UK is so important, and I'm very honoured to be supporting you tonight. So in this session, I'll be telling you a bit about how I went from growing up in London to serving in the unit of the Israeli army responsible for the military's media and communications operations, the IDF Spokesperson's unit. I'll start by telling you about my background and story before explaining in more detail the history, structure, and mission of the IDF Spokesperson's unit. And then we'll try to give you an insight into my service, both as a regular soldier and now as a reservist in the unit. At the end, please feel free to ask any questions that you may have, or write them in the chat as we go, and then I'll take them at the end. And so yeah, we'll begin. So firstly, I'll tell you a bit about myself, my background, and how I ended up as an Israeli, albeit with a fairly obviously British accent. I grew up in London in a very Zionist family with a close connection to Israel. While we don't have any family in Israel, we made frequent visits there on holiday, and the state of Israel was always something we were extremely proud of and inspired by at home. During my teenage years, I became involved in B'nai Akiva youth movement here in the UK. First as a chanech, as a participant, and then later as a madrich, as a leader. And I became very attached to the ideology of B'nai Akiva, the religious Zionist ideology that it promotes, Torah v'Avodah v'Aliyah, and Aliyah was a very important part of the ideology that we were taught, and then went on to teach other chanechim other participants as Madrichim. And it was on Israel tour when I was 16, with B'nai Akiva on the 1-month trip that so many British Jewish teenagers take as a rite of passage, that has unfortunately been suspended in the last couple of years because of COVID, but a while ago. This was when I really saw Israel for the first time as something that I wanted to actively be part of. And it was the enormous sense of the past, present, and future of the Jewish people converging in this small strip of land that really captivated me and I found very powerful, even at a relatively young age. And as a proud and connected Jew, I felt that I wanted to be a small part of living this story, and taking the opportunity that generations of our ancestors had longed for, but never saw actualized, which was a live Jewish state. And that's when I more or less made up my mind about Aliyah when I was 16. I was quite set on it from then, but I didn't go straight away. I decided to obviously stay and continue my education in the UK, and when the time is right, the time will be right. And so I finished my A-levels at the City London School. After this, I went on to read French and Spanish, as Steve said, at the University of Leeds Modern Languages, which was a very formative experience in a different way. I was very active with Jewish life on campus, but I'll just tell you a short story about my time abroad, which every languages student that in the UK takes a year abroad. I was very fortunate to spend a few months in France and then 9 months in Argentina and Buenos Aires. Were amazing experiences. But I'll tell you about France. As you can see from the pictures I've got up, I went in April of 2015, which was 3 months after the terrible Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher attacks in Paris, which shocked the world, shocked the Jewish community, shocked the French Jewish community to the core, to the very core. And when I arrived in Bordeaux, this was 3 months after, there was armed military presence, the French army patrolling around the synagogue in Bordeaux 24 hours a day. They'd taken over the entire Beit Midrash of the shul as their sort of barracks. There was a tiny school in the community as well of Bordeaux, and once again there was always French soldiers standing outside as the small school operated. And it was a very powerful experience to see this. For a long time, I'd felt the pull factors towards Aliyah, the ideology, the things I described before, being part of the Jewish story and all of these things. But I understood for the first time that there are the push factors towards Aliyah that so many hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews who have ended up making their lives in Israel have felt. And so this was a very informative experience for me. And ultimately, when I finished my degree, I got on a plane fairly shortly after, but maybe without the rose-tinted glasses of a 16-year-old. And I signed up for a program called the Israel Government Fellowship, which was a 10-month internship program for graduates run by the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem and Massa, which is funded by the Jewish Agency. This was an excellent program. It was really very well run. I've got here the picture of the other participants from around the world who came for this 10-month program. And I was very privileged to have an internship placement in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. And for me, it was the whole idea of doing this program was more of a test run for Aliyah. I wanted to see what professional conditions were like, what the opportunities were, and it was very successful in that front. I was very, very fortunate to see from the inside the scope of the work that Israeli diplomats do in the Israeli Foreign Ministry and further afield. My specific role was working as the assistant to Israel's non-resident ambassador to Malta and Slovenia, and also working with incoming official delegations who were visiting Israel with the Foreign Ministry from European countries, politicians, academics, journalists. So I had a fantastic exposure there and a really, really interesting work experience. And during this year, I made up my mind that this was definitely going to stay in Israel. I was living in Jerusalem. and began to plan what was going to come next after my aliyah, after the program was finished. And this is when I seriously considered serving in the IDF for the first time. And I'd always wanted to make aliyah, but I wanted to contribute, but it hadn't necessarily crossed my mind because of my age and the difference between coming as a 23, 24-year-old, 22-year-old and an 18-year-old when the average Israeli drafts. But you may ask anyway, like, isn't it obligatory to serve in the army even as an immigrant? Did I have a choice in this matter? Well, once upon a time, new immigrants up to the age of around 30 were all drafted to the IDF, but often for very short periods of time, 3 months, 6 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. It was a very inefficient program because new Olim were coming and they were waiting to get into the army, and then they couldn't find jobs, and then it was only for 3 months. From the army's point of view, they trained somebody up for a month and then they only got 2 months of service up, and maybe some reserve duty after that. But it wasn't a very efficient process. So in 2015 they changed the law, and the new law stated that new Olim from the age of 22 and above will not be drafted to the IDF. Have no obligation to go in the IDF unless you're a doctor. That's just special circumstances, didn't apply to me. But if you are between the ages of 22 and 26 and you've made aliyah and you would like to serve, you have to serve and commit to a minimum of 18 months if you're a guy, 12 months if you're a girl, and then it's possible to serve. And so after some considerable deliberation, I decided that more work or further study could wait down the line, and the opportunity to serve my new country and its military, a cornerstone institution of the State of Israel, as we all know, and a rite of passage for so many Israelis to go through, which is military service, was the obvious path to have a smooth integration and to contribute. So my decision was made, and I officially made aliyah in July of 2018, completing the full gamut of Jewish agency-funded programs. I signed up for the world-famous Ulpan Etzion in Jerusalem, where I lived and studied for the first 5 months after becoming an Israeli. Very importantly, I improved my Hebrew. Even more importantly, I made a great community of friends of other Olim. And I also had the time to tackle the complications of drafting to the IDF. Because the Israeli army is famous the world over for its effectiveness on the battlefield, daring operations, both those known to the public and those that are not, and deployment of cutting-edge technology. It is, however, also a mammoth organization, a huge conscript army with a very bureaucratic nature that reflects other parts of the Israeli government as well. And it's very difficult to navigate this system, especially drafting, even for Sabra native-born Israelis. So I needed the time to work through that. But age 23 at the time of my aliyah, I was very determined from the offset to try and contribute to the skills that I built up from my degree, my languages, the experience I had in the MFA, and Jewish Hasbara on campus and whatever. And I really wanted to contribute those skills in the service as effectively as I could during my service. It was going to be 18 months. And this led me to the IDF Spokesperson's unit, known in Hebrew as Dovel Tzal. This is the unit which is responsible broadly for communicating the IDF's messages to the media, both domestic and international, and the general public. I'll get on to in a moment what the IDF Spokesperson's unit does and is in more detail. And it wasn't necessarily an easy journey to get there. However, after my basic training, I was finally assigned a place in the unit and able to continue my service there. So before I continue with my own experience in the unit, I can hear through the airwaves of Zoom many of you thinking, what exactly is the IDF Spokesperson's unit and how does it operate? Well, to answer this, I'll share some of the history of the unit, its objectives, and how it's structured, which I hope you'll find interesting and informative. So, it goes back to 1948, the establishment of the state. This is Moshe Perlman. He was the first of El Tzal. He was the first IDF spokesman. And he has a very interesting story. He was born and raised in a very religious home in London. He went on to study at the LSE and then trained as a journalist. During the 1930s, Perlman became involved in the Labour Zionist movement and was close to many of the Free State leaders and of the Jewish Agency at that time. And then in 1948, now that he was living in the new state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion appointed Moshe Perlman, who was equipped with an appropriately cut glass British accent, to liaise with foreign reporters on behalf of the IDF, the newly formed IDF at the time. And he became the first of El Tzal. He became the first IDF spokesperson, a role which he served in for 4 years until 1952, after which he went on to serve in various capacities in Israel's public diplomacy apparatus, including in the Prime Minister's office. And he wrote a number of books, including on the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960. One interesting story about him, whilst he was the Dover, whilst he was the IDF spokesman, which I think illustrates his character somewhat, and maybe that of the other quite fearless early leaders of the state, was that at the age of 39 at the time, he decided to take on the training course in the brand new paratroopers unit of the IDF, which had just been formed. He was very insistent, even though he wasn't planning to actively serve as a paratrooper. He was busy enough, I think, but he passed the training for the Samchanim, for the paratroopers, with great success. So with Moshe Perlman, the IDF spokesperson's unit was born, and clearly a great character. Over the decades since, the place of the office of the IDF spokesman, it was always a man until the 2000s, shifted around within the army. But for many years, it was a branch of the Military Intelligence Directorate, Modi'in. And the commander of the IDF spokesperson's unit, the spokesperson, him or herself, is a very senior ranking officer, the rank of Brigadier General, one cross on the shoulder, and has a seat on the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces. And there have been some very famous figures who have held this position over the years. One of them here I've got up on the screen is Nachman Shai, who today is a Labour member of Knesset and a minister in Israel's government. He's the Minister of Diaspora Affairs. Nachman Shai was the IDF spokesman during the Gulf War in the early 90s. And under the threat of Scud missiles from Iraq, Nachman Shai was a famously calming voice for Israelis, telling them to have their masks at the ready, be close to shelters, and was famous for telling them also on news broadcasts to drink water to help Then there is another example is Miri Regev, who was the IDF spokesperson during the 2005 disengagement from Gaza and 2006 Lebanon war, who has since gone into politics and was a minister in the last government and is a prominent figure in Netanyahu's Likud party. So overall, the IDF spokesman and the unit itself is very well known in Israel and further afield. But now I'll tell you a little more about the structure of the Tzal, of the unit itself, as this quite closely informs its primary missions and goals. So the focus of the IDF spokesperson's unit is not, as many would assume, to communicate the story of the IDF to the world in English. It is most heavily focused on communicating messages from the army to the domestic audience in Hebrew. Now, the main reason for this is that the IDF is by far the most trusted institution in the state of Israel, protecting the lives of Israeli citizens since day one, each and every minute of the day, both during times of war and quiet. However, this trust must be upheld, it must be maintained, and a key part of that is making the Israeli public aware of how the IDF is doing its job, what it's doing. Because while, of course, not all operational activity is made public, and Israelis fully understand this, it is crucial for those parents sending their sons and daughters off to military service at the age of 18, that they're doing this for a reason. And that's a very large part of the raison d'etre of the Tzal. It's also very important to stress that the IDF spokesperson's unit may be contrary to how it's portrayed abroad, or even somewhat in Israel. is answerable to any Israeli government, regardless of the coalition makeup, regardless of who the defense minister, prime minister is. It's non-partisan and carries out orders as are given by the political leadership. So the structure of the unit reflects its priorities and mission. The majority of the unit is the Israeli media branch that deals with domestic journalists, reporters, national campaigns as well. For example, specific units sometimes go in and out of fashion in terms of drafting, and when the IDF is looking specifically to have a strong emphasis on recruitment to the tanks, to the Shirion, for example, then the Dovel Tzal will run a specific campaign on this. So that's what comes under the branch of Israeli media. Then there's the much smaller international media branch, which is where I served, and I'll come on to speak more about that. But this branch, the international branch, deals with English, French, Spanish, and Russian, as well as German audiences primarily. And it's the face of the world's media. Works with the international branch, works with foreign reporters on a day-to-day basis, all year round, those that are based in Israel, those that are not. And then the third and final kind of focus, we've had the Hebrew international, and then there's a small Arabic branch, which is directed towards Arab Israelis, Palestinians, and Arabs across the Middle East, communicating the IDF's messages to them. Obviously, each and every branch has different ways of, operating and communicating with their audiences in the most appropriate way, and that's very much just part of the way the unit operates. Although that's not always an easy balance to strike. It's something that is just part of the nature of it. On screen, sorry, here was on the right hand side is Hidai Zilberman. He was the previous IDF spokesperson, and this is Ram Kochav, who is the new spokesperson that changed over in the summer. Many of you are likely to have seen the international spokesperson, the head of the international branch, speaking on Sky News or the BBC over the years, Channel 4, etc. Until recently, this was Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, and he was replaced in the summer by Amnon Scheffler, who is the new international Dovel. And previously, before Jonathan, was Peter Lerner, who was of British extraction as well. And this is obviously a very, very important job and important position in the unit. Then there's Avichai Adrier, Lieutenant Colonel Avichai Adrier, who is the head of the Arabic branch of the IDF and the IDF's Arabic language spokesperson. He's been in this role for many years and is a very, very well-known figure in the Arab world across the Middle East. As a result of appearances on Arab language television and his very large social media presence. I'll leave you to judge whether it's a favorable reception that he gains or not, but it's not quite so black and white. But there's Avichai is occasionally held up as a bogeyman in the Arab world for Israel's actions, but he is a superb spokesperson and very, very charismatic. So, as Steve said at the beginning, I served in the social media branch of the social media team in the international branch. So this is what I'm going to speak about a bit more now. With the onset of new media or social media in the late 2000s, the IDF spokesperson's unit became one of the very first militaries in the world to adapt to the rapid growth of these platforms. During Operation Cast Lead in Gaza back in 2008-2009, the IDF spokesperson's unit made its first foray into the use of social media. And like much of the Israeli government at the time, and to an extent now, but less so, the IDF spokesperson's unit was still using fax machines as one of its primary means of communications. This changed when two young immigrant soldiers during the operation saw the opportunity to use new media to the IDF's advantage. And they suggested to their commanders that it would be useful to open a YouTube page in English to share footage of operational events, that were being broadcast on television, but nowhere else, in order to make the IDF's messages more accessible to the growing online audience. They also launched an initiative to expand the unit's remit from working with reporters from traditional newspapers and outlets to working with bloggers as well. Blogs were all the rage at the time, and this was another way of amplifying the IDF's message in an effective way for the new era of social media. Thus, the IDF Spokesperson's unit social media team was born. There's been a lot of literature actually written about the founding of the IDF social media team and progression over the years. You can see it in a book called War in 140 Characters and another one called Like War. They go into quite significant detail about these the founding of the IDF social media and what it means more broadly for warfare in the modern age. And in subsequent years, this was already 12, 13 years ago, the social media operations of the unit have evolved very significantly and grown exponentially in line with the growth of these technologies themselves. You don't need me to tell you how social media has taken over large parts of our lives in ways that were unforeseeable so many years ago. And the Valsal, the IDF Spokesperson's unit, has adapted to that and run with the concept over the years. So now for over a decade, the IDF has had an English language social media presence on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as a blog and website. In later years, Instagram account was opened and followed. And even more recently, there has been we opened a TikTok account, Telegram, and even LinkedIn in recent years. So there's a lot of different platforms going on. And each platform has a different type of audience. What you're posting on TikTok, aiming at a younger generation to influence them, and the content that we have there is very different to what you'd have maybe on Twitter or on Facebook. So that's part of the day-to-day work of the team. In addition to the English language presence, the IDF Spokesperson's unit also manages accounts in French, Spanish, and Russian, as well as obviously Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian. Persian being managed by the Arabic department. This is certainly unique. No other military in the world has as broad a public social media presence in so many languages and so many different platforms. And it's a response to the unique interest that there is in Israel and in the IDF from around the world. But it's also of our own initiative to take the lead on this front and use these very powerful tools in the best way that we possibly can. So if you're not following already the accounts, then you may not know, but there are millions of followers in total if you add up all the languages together. And then the way the social media platforms amplify the information, what we post goes to many more millions of people, not just the followers themselves. So they're clearly of great importance, but you may think, well, why does somebody in, I don't know, on the west coast of the States who has no influence over anything and is just sitting at home scrolling through their media, social media, why does the IDF need to speak to somebody like that in English? It's not going to have any direct. Well, of course, you can't know everybody. You can't know who reads every single tweet. You can't have that. And not everyone who reads a tweet or receives information and watches a video, reads an article that we've written with information and our messaging in, is in an influential position. But especially in democratic societies, having that support of the masses is extremely, extremely important. We know that from many years of the US-Israel relationship, the UK-Israel relationship, and with other relationships between democracies. But there is also the great ability through social media to see and really actually see when a tweet or a message is shared and amplified or even read by somebody influential. You can see, for example, when a senior advisor in the White House directly retweets the IDF, they're paying attention to what the IDF is saying. They may be absorbing it. We're on the radar, and we're going to be part of the talking points of important discussions going on concerning whatever is going on in the Middle East. And another very important thing is that so much of traditional media outlets' output now is based on what's going on social media. So gone are the days where it was maybe the other way around, when the traditional media, television stations, radio, newspapers set the agenda. Now the agenda is set by social media. And when the New York Times or the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, or Le Monde directly embeds or quotes a tweet in the language of the IDF, you know that policymakers and influencers reading these newspapers will pick up on it again, and they may choose to follow, and they may carry on. So there's a knock-on effect, and it is extremely important, both in reaching, as I say, the masses, and in influential policymakers and decision makers and influencers as well, which we'll talk about in a bit later on. But yes, we're always looking for the best and most effective ways to reach these audiences. So back to my service. I said earlier on that I completed my basic training, and I was assigned to this unit with this great tradition and this very well-known reputation in Israel and further abroad. And I found myself posted to the International Social Media Unit, which is, as I said, responsible for English, French, Spanish, and Russian social media content. At the time, the head of social media was Major Karen Hajioff, who I know has a very strong connection with the ZF, and has just recently been appointed spokesperson, international spokesperson of Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister. So I think I was the only, Karen was a British Ola, and I was the only British Ola in the unit at the time. But there were many other Olim amongst the soldiers and officers in our team, due to the language requirements. So that was a really very, very vibrant environment to be part of. The social media team works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Shabbat, Chagim, anytime that something is needed that is operational, in order to get the messages out, whether it's about events in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Syria, or further afield, whether it's explaining the threats that we're facing and how they impact Israeli civilians, or the history of the IDF, past operations, showing why they're still important today. Something called, in the army, it's called Moreshet Krav, the legacy of combat and the legacy of war. Sharing that with the world is important. Showing the new technology that the IDF is using and leading on this front is another important output of our communications. And profiling the stories of soldiers in English in all these different languages to give a human face of the IDF, which otherwise people don't see unless you are on the ground in Israel. And highlighting trends in the IDF as well, the things that are happening people don't know about, whether it's women serving in combat units, or Israeli minorities serving in various different units, Druze soldiers, Christian soldiers, Muslim soldiers, and the diversity of the IDF, and as well as our humanitarian missions, profiling those. This is a major part of the international image we'd like to project, and is not always necessarily given the coverage it deserves, but through social media we can try and set the agenda and pump out as much of this content as we can to set this narrative. And again, we're constantly thinking about the different audiences that there are, not only in terms of the geographic locations and languages, but also in terms of supporters, those who are neutral and those who are hostile, and how we balance the different messages. So it's a very complex situation to manage, but that's part of the job. I was responsible in the unit for writing English language content for a variety of different output that we had, from scripts to videos, tweets that were announcing operational updates or more strategic messaging, sending a message to our enemies further afield using social media to do that. And of course, in this role, accuracy was of utmost importance. The last thing you want is a tweet that has come from the IDF social media team with bad spelling and bad grammar that is then beamed up on CNN for the world to see. So that's one of the advantages as well of having native speakers and Olim working in these units, in these teams. We were also unafraid to use sass and sarcasm when appropriate, not always, but this was when directed at our enemies or trying to send a certain message. And some people deem this to be inappropriate for the IDF to be doing in the official voice of the military. But this was speaking the language of the internet. The internet has its own language. And in an environment where tens of billions of messages are sent out each day, gaining anyone's attention for your specific cause is a massive part of the battle. And if no one is following you because your content is dull, predictable, and poorly thought out, then no one will listen to you when you want them to listen. So having this extra edge, creating attention, creating a buzz, increased our following and broadened our ability to get our message to as many people as we could. Later on in my service, I worked full-time on operational planning and strategy for the social media team. And I also served during Operation Black Belt, which was in November 2019, when the IDF successfully targeted an Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander in Gaza, Bahu Aba Alata, beginning an intense round of fighting for a number of days afterwards. This was one of the mark points of my service, but many other things as well. Then there was, of course, the coronavirus, which was a very surreal environment. We were working from home for a short period of time during the lockdown, but communicating messages of the IDF, as everyone was doing, communicating their messages of what was going on in their different countries and their militaries via social media at that time. So I was released from my regular service in November 2020 after 22 months in total, serving as a lone soldier. Very fulfilling service, and I was back to being a civilian. But I abruptly returned from the relative quiet of civilian life on May 10th, 2021, when Hamas fired rockets from Gaza towards Jerusalem on Yom Yerushalayim, as I'm sure you all remember, just a few months ago. At the time, Israel was facing multiple problems. At the onset of the operation, politically, internally, there was deadlock. Ethnic tensions had been boiling for weeks and months before, even between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and an escalation seemed inevitable. But nonetheless, it was a big wake-up call when Jerusalem was attacked. It hadn't been attacked under rocket fire since 2014 during Operation Edge. And then over the next 11 days, rockets were fired into Israel at the highest intensity that there had ever been. And of course, the IDF responded in turn, targeting Hamas military and terror targets across the Gaza Strip in a fierce round of fighting. I returned straight away to my unit as a reservist, pretty much doing my old job, a mix of writing and strategy. But obviously in a war and in an operation of this scale, the speed and urgency required, and the quality as well, under such conditions is significantly elevated. As a unit, we were, of course, working around the clock, day and night shifts, releasing operational updates to the domestic and international media, as the eyes of the world were very much on Israel, the IDF, Gaza, Hamas, in that window of time. I mean, to give you a sense of what it's like to be as a soldier a bit further, you're always trying to anticipate what's coming next, as I think everyone everyone involved in public diplomacy is, and how you can plan for that, but also what is the most urgent challenge that we have to deal with, what is the most urgent message to get out, content that is needed, where the conversation is heading within the traditional media spheres and on the social media spheres. So it's a big challenge. Personally as well, I had never fully experienced such an onslaught of a rocket attack, and I was, for many times during my service, I'd written about sirens that were sounding in southern Israel, rocket attacks from Gaza, Israeli civilians running for their lives, living in Jerusalem and on base in Tel Aviv. This was, quite, it was often the south that was targeted and not the center of Israel. And of course, this was different this time. And to come under rocket fire, I mean, at one point I was outside and away from a shelter. It's a very dramatic and quite a difficult experience to deal with, and you see that it's not just small. This is not an attack that is easily defended. If we didn't have the Iron Dome and we didn't have that incredible life-saving technology, then there will be many more casualties. And how Israelis are not willing to tolerate living under this sort of threat and this sort of intensity of attack, as nobody in the world would do. And when you feel it, maybe personally or as a nation at once, the messages you're sending out to the world become even more urgent, I think, to try and convey what's going on. But as we all saw, social media was a key battleground of public opinion during the operation. In a way, it hadn't been before. The extent hadn't been before. This time around, the judgments and interventions of celebrities and influencers across the board, from the models in the States, the Bella and Gigi Hadid, the of Palestinian descent, both with tens of millions of followers on their social media accounts, to John Oliver and Trevor Noah, focusing on Israel and the conflict, and lasering in on as well on social media. And it was a very tough environment. Of course, with social media, the absence of nuance, everything's condensed to 280 characters or one graphic, when of course everything is far more complicated, and that makes everything more difficult to communicate. And we felt this and tried to react to it in the best way, as we always do. It's with our messaging in mind. And it was also very clear that from the broader social media conversation, beyond what the IDF was saying, that the criticism of what was going on was not any, there was some people saying this IDF military shouldn't be doing this. This is crossing a red line. But so much of the discourse that you could see was no longer just critical of the IDF. It was critical of Israel's entire raison d'etre, right to exist. No, there were no longer any boundaries between saying things specifically about military action and our whole being. And this is a big challenge we've got to face in the long term, and a narrative that has to be countered. That's not just for the IDF to do, that's for a broader apparatus of the public diplomacy in Israel to do, and for our friends abroad. But that was a very big thing that we noticed, obviously, and everyone noticed during this time. When it comes to traditional media, there were challenges in the British media and American media, as I'm sure you're aware, criticism and maybe accusations of bias against Israel, others going the other direction. But I think the natural territory of traditional media was enabled a balance to still take place, a somewhat balanced argument. Whereas on social media, that was almost impossible due to the nature of the discourse. And I will say as well something about traditional diplomacy, which is linked to everything that we're doing, and I've discussed, but is also more dealt with by the Israeli Foreign Ministry and the political leadership. But I think we saw very good results during Operation Guardian of the Walls on this front. The new US government showed strong public understanding and support for Israel, vetoing UN security resolutions criticizing Israel at the time and giving us the support to carry out the operation. European governments as well came forward in a way we hadn't seen before. In the past, maybe been very critical, but they showed support openly and behind closed doors. Maybe after many years of terror attacks on the European continent, the thinking has changed amongst the leadership. Crucially, there was no damage to the new alliances done with Abraham Accords countries during this conflict, again suggesting an understanding, and that amongst maybe the world's leadership there is a greater acceptance of Israel's case. In the media it's still challenging, and on social media when we're reaching the masses, it's a very, very different ballgame. And juggling all of these three things is going to be a long-term challenge. I'm very proud of our efforts during the war. I know there was everyone has an opinion on how the IDF portrays itself on social media and in general, the Spokesperson unit. Our posts were combined from English, French, Spanish, and Russian on all the different platforms. They were viewed over 500 million times. So it's a massive, massive reach with our messaging. But we've obviously got room to improve in the future. And efforts to explain Israel's position has always been a challenge and always will be. But we mustn't give up. We don't live in a vacuum. What people say in Israel about Israel has a domino effect, as I tried to explain earlier, and plays into our work as well in Devar Tzahal. And we can be proud of this story to tell. We're on the right side of history. The enemies facing Israel and the IDF are very much the bad guys. This is a military that goes to unprecedented measures to act according to the highest ethical and moral standards, and both to protect its own civilians, its own soldiers, and the lives that are sadly caught in the crossfire. This is the truth, and it has to be told. And in conclusion of my talk, I'm just going to say that I'm very, very proud to be an Oleh, an Israeli, and now having served in the IDF. I believe Israel is a land of opportunity, so inspired by the people I've met along the way there. And serving in Devar Tzahal in the IDF Spokesperson's unit, literally speaking in the name of the Israel Defense Forces and all that means, was a tremendous honor and privilege, very challenging, but very rewarding. We have work to do, but we always have work to do on this front. And so there's no stopping us beginning it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ben, for that. It was a very, very fascinating presentation, and a very fascinating insight into your role and into your life. Ben, could I ask you just to stop sharing your screen? Thank you. Okay. So yeah, a really fascinating insight into one of arguably the IDF's most important units, because we live in like you were saying, we live in an age where information travels across the world at the speed of light. And there was someone who said, I can't remember who it was, but something about when someone spreads a lie, the truth is just getting its trousers on, or something to that effect. And yeah, it's very true in this day and age. So thanks. So I have a few questions here for you. As I'm moderating, I'm going to take the chutzpah of asking one of my own first. So as you said to our audience this evening, you were called up as a reservist during Operation Guardian of the Walls. How many years are you signed up for as a reservist? How many years does that go on for as I understand it, it's Miluim is the
that's a very good question. I have no idea. I think for as long as I'm useful, I think I'll be going back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please God, there won't be too
Please
many.
God, there will be no need for that, of course. Yeah, no,
but it's obviously very vital and important work that you do.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I will just add to that the reservists in the unit are a great pool of great resource for the unit in times of trouble, because they've seen it all before, or they work in professional roles in the communications world and come back and provide their expertise. So it's an important.
Is there actually an age cutoff for reservists?
In combat there is.
Right.
I think it's in early to mid 40s. For a non-combat unit like Devar Tzahal, I don't think there necessarily is. Again, it's like a case of relevance and need, I think.
Right. Okay. Got someone in our audience here has said, hi Ben, it seems like the world doesn't want to hear the IDF side of the story. It's something that for us was evident when they targeted the Associated Press building in Gaza. So yeah, it seems like the world doesn't want to hear the IDF side of the story, and the anti-Israel lobby is huge and relentless. Is it an uphill struggle trying to put the IDF's point of view to the outside world?
Well, first of all, yes, it is an uphill struggle. I think I've I went through some of the difficulties that we have, and some of the ways we go about trying to deal with this. I don't think it's a necessarily impossible task, and it's also very, very much audience-based. As I said just towards the end, when we're speaking to world leaders who understand these issues much more intimately and understand military decisions and how the threat of terrorism faces their own citizens, then we have a more receptive audience. And we're talking to people who are very uninformed about the conflict. See an Instagram post, see a tweet from a celebrity that they follow about this that makes a sweeping judgment that's totally uninformed, or somewhat uninformed, not too critical, but then I think we've got a major issue, and those are, as you said just before about lies, they spread very quickly, and the more, how can I put this, that the better that it's dressed, the better the information is dressed up and in the shorter form as possible, and the easier it is for people to spread. I don't think it's impossible, and we've had a lot of challenges in the past in public diplomacy before the era of social media, from before the state was established right through to the moment that it was established, and ever since. And I think it's something that will stay with us, and we just need really focus on it and do our best, make the best of our resources.
Certainly no easy task when you're literally under fire.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. What do you think? Might need to rephrase it, or what does what do soldiers think? Soldiers such as yourself think of the group breaking the silence? I understand you might be somewhat restricted in what you
yeah, I'm not, maybe I won't go into any personal opinions on this, but I can talk about it from a broader social media perspective.
Yep.
You see, firstly, I think it's a fantastic thing that Israel is a democratic country and anyone can say what they like. That's a very important part of our country's DNA.
Absolutely.
I think what you do see is a strong influence, when we're talking about social media and traditional media, of groups that are critical of Israel from within Israel. That's for sure. And it's another aspect of this narrative. It's never going to be black and white. It's never going to be as simple as everyone in Israel supports what the Israeli government is doing and everyone else is against us. It's not like that. But yeah, it's an added complication of it.
Okay, thanks for that. Got a question here. How would you recommend that we tackle ignorance, such as what's happened here recently, what's come into the news with Sally Rooney, the Irish author, who's refused to have her latest book translated into Hebrew? From your experience in the IDF spokesperson unit and your experience as an Israeli, and someone who still has strong ties to this country as well, how would you recommend that we tackle that ignorance or that misguided understanding?
Yes.
Perhaps ignorance is not always the case.
Yeah. Look, I think it's maybe somewhat detached from the specifics of a military operation here, and we're talking about a different angle of criticism on Israel that we've seen building up over many years, the accusations that Israel is an apartheid state. Yep. And it's a drip effect. There's always another report. There's the Human Rights Watch report, and then there's Ben and Jerry's, and then there's Sally Rooney. And we see this drip effect, and I think it's it's dangerous and it has an impact. I mean, I'm currently in London, and I saw Sally Rooney's books are all front and center in Waterstones. So she's a an influential figure who people know about. How we go about this, countering it, is a very big question. It's a difficult one. It doesn't always. I'll say what doesn't always help. I'm not necessarily sure I have the perfect answer, but it doesn't always help when Israeli government officials come out and blast what's gone on, because then it's like a state is ganging up on an individual author, and that doesn't necessarily look good. And in other ways, in institutions as well. I think, look, the best we could hope for as well is to cultivate voices who are open to debate within the arts and cultural world, promote them, ensure that they have as a big platform as possible in order to rebut what's happening when people like Sally Rooney come out and say that they're boycotting Israel. And I know that's not necessarily a solution to all our issues. But another thing that's also counterculture with culture as well. Whether we have a greater promotion of Israeli culture in the world, in the Western world, more even more translations of our literature and of film. And I think we've seen in recent years as well, through Netflix and whatever, the interest in Israeli output is very, very strong.
Yeah.
And those do have an effect as well. We might not realize, necessarily instantly, but it's like, oh wow, Israel, isn't what I expected it to be.
Yeah.
So maybe more of that, and maybe that will counter the weight of the drip effect that I was describing before.
No, it's a great answer, and like you say, what doesn't help is when some of Israel's leaders in the past have come out quite strongly, in less than you could argue that going on the attack rather than the defense, where you can present the facts as they are and try and educate people about that it's not black and white, and there's there's perspectives from both sides, etc. So thanks for that. Got another question here. A gentleman who observes here that he's heard from other sources that the sheer population densities and consequent loss of wriggle room will make it more and more difficult to defend Israel against more sophisticated rocket attacks, such as the Iranian supplied rockets that make their way to Gaza. What he says here is, of course, many believe that Hashem defends Israel, but what is your view? Because obviously, you've got a density that exists in Gaza, but then there's also the density that exists in Israel.
Yeah, look, there's no secret about it. The rocket arsenals that Hamas have, they showed that in 11 days of Operation Protective Guardian of the Walls, they could fire as many rockets at Israel as they did in 51 days during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. So there's a strong capability there. There's no secret that in Lebanon, Hezbollah have a weapons arsenal of well over 130,000 rockets, long-range rockets that can reach every city in Israel. And the long-running aim of of Iran, to equip Hezbollah in Lebanon with precision-guided missiles, which would be even more dangerous to Israeli population centers and strategic targets. And of course, potential longer-range threats. Not enough to say, as Nachman Shai, the spokesman, said, to drink water. I don't think that's gonna help. But we're living in a very dangerous region. But we have to also take note of the fact that yes, Israel invests heavily in aerial defense, whether it's short range like the Iron Dome, or longer range missile defense systems such as the Patriot system, which was also developed in conjunction with the US, and that there's still something that's lasted for decades, a deterrence factor that Israel is the strongest military in the region, come what may. It will continue to be forever. That's not, no national leader will ever want to sacrifice that position. and will do whatever they can to ensure that's the case.
Sure. Sure.
That's the short answer, I suppose.
Drawing to a close, got another member of the audience has said, one of the things they think that came across from the celebrity interventions, such as the Bella and Gigi Haddad interventions online, was that they seemed to concentrate on the idea that the conflict wasn't fair, i.e. that the Palestinians are significantly militarily weaker. You know, the whole David and Goliath thing that has been around for many years now. What conflict is fought on the basis of fairness? Was this noticed, and was there any strategies to tackle this ridiculous focus? As we do, it is something that comes up on, you know, repeatedly about proportionality, the misunderstanding of what the concept of proportionality is in warfare.
For sure. Yes, I think it's something we definitely consider, you know, consider the entire time that we're viewing these issues from a broad lens and working out what to say and how to portray what's going on. Whether it's a case of, you know, fairness, we're not going to necessarily stand up and say, well, I'll rephrase that. I'd say a large part of the messaging is always the fact that, look, the rockets were attacks that began from Hamas's side, from Gaza. They targeted Israel first. They are targeting civilians. It's indiscriminate against Jews, Muslims, Christians living in the state of Israel. It doesn't matter who they're targeting. That's a strong part of the narrative. Another thing as well is also stressing that as much as we can, that you know, yes, this is war, things are unfair, and it's a terrible tragedy when civilians, you know, on the other side are caught up in the crossfire, as I said before. But this is something we talk about and we openly acknowledge as Israel, and we're an ethical, you know, moral democracy. We are not an equivalent. So we don't have the same values, and making the comparison to distinguish the two of us in terms of values and ethics is extremely important and difficult. But this is something in recent years that the terrorist groups in Gaza have become very skilled at doing. Their messaging has become mainstream messaging when it comes to pro-Palestinian or, you know, anti-Israel debates, and people very easily forget that this is Hamas, who is a terrorist organization recognized by the international community with a violent jihadi Islamist ideology who wants to see Israel wiped off the map. And so we're just not dealing in fair when it, you know, with them. The more we can make that distinction, the better. If we haven't done it clearly enough until now, we've got to do it better. And I think that's the best thing I can say about that. Best we can do.
I mean, for us here, it's, you know, it's galling to see so many in our media trying to strike an equivalence between a sovereign state, you know, a UN member state, and an internationally prescribed terrorist organization, and yet they continually try to strike that equivalence. It's a dangerous one. Got another one here. I've got two more, and then we'll call it a day, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, no problem.
Have you personally dealt with the foreign media, and how was this experience for you?
I didn't personally work in a position where I was dealing with journalists, but the entire branch sits together. So it's like a shared effort, and we're thinking about what we write on social media, how that'll be taken up by the journalists, and vice versa, and what the journalists are saying about the IDF and how we're being portrayed. So it's very much a shared effort. You can't isolate anymore between social and traditional media. It just doesn't work. The boundaries are totally blurred.
Yep.
But no, I have not. I mean, yes, I have some experience of it, but it wasn't my primary profession.
Okay.
Primary occupation in the.
Right, thanks. And I'm going to ask one last question, and I ask this as a parent with kids of my own. What was your parents' reaction when you decided that you would want to go to Israel and then sign up into the IDF?
A good question. The very first thing I said in my talk was that I come from a very Zionist family, and that's especially true of my parents.
Wonderful.
And they were very supportive. I'm very, very lucky, and they obviously miss not being able to visit at the moment due to the restrictions that have been in place. But they were happy once I also told them I wasn't going into a combat unit, so they were able to sleep a little easier. But yeah, I'm very thankful for their support.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you this evening and hearing all about your experiences, both as an Oleh Hadash and a soldier in the IDF. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone else who joined us this evening. I will endeavour to send a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording of this evening. And in the meantime, Ben, thank you. Be well. Please God, please God, you won't have to return too often to the IDF, and you'll get to enjoy a normal life, so to speak. Everyone else, thank you for joining us on behalf of us, the ZF, and the WZO here in the UK. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.